So we got a brief history of how racial segregation in housing came to be, the federal policies that moved it along, the local policies that moved it along. And we really got a sense of how that impacts not just the private market, but the public housing market as well. We talked about the relationship between disinvestment in communities of color that are sort of exacerbated by the segregation that exists in this city, and the cycles of gentrification that are playing out today. Now, again, of course, people have different views on what gentrification is, whether displacement is or isn't a part of it. So that conversation was in full display last go round, and we're going to talk a little bit about that again today. But lastly, just the role of developers. Being able to capitalize on low-cost land simply to make a profit, and how that impacts communities across the city. So that's where we started, and we're picking up right where we left off. Again, looking at some of the intersections that exist between housing and education, public safety, et cetera.
Yeah. So it was a really rich conversation. Some panelists argued that policies that focus on racial integration end up tokenizing and isolating people of color, moving them far away from their extended family and support networks, and diverting attention and resources away from collective efforts seeking equity and reinvestment for communities of color as a whole. These panelists offered the critique that the focus of our public policy intervention should be desegregating resources, not necessarily on desegregating people.
And so I think just last, before we move into our panel, there was really a rich sharing of the lack of access for persons with disability to affordable housing. And how, regardless of all the different interventions that have happened over the decades, persons with disabilities are still getting the short end of the stick. And so really struggling with our policymakers to figure out how to create greater equity across the board. So not just in terms of racial demographics or economic demographics, but also, again, taking into consideration the special needs that persons with disabilities have in terms of the housing market. So let's jump into our panel.
Okay, sounds like a plan. All right, so without further delay, we're going to go ahead and introduce the fantastic panelists that have generously joined us today. Our panel today is actually not focused on segregation in housing and segregation of resources, but on understanding everything else that grows out of that. Today we're looking at intersections between issues, housing and education, housing and policing, housing and transportation, and housing and employment access. And being a coalition of action that cares about solving problems, not just describing them, we are also going to be taking a look together at politics today. Specifically, we're going to be talking about how the city's segregation itself shapes politics in Chicago, as well as political possibility, and what we need to do as a result. So our first panelist today will be Dr. EWING. Professor Ewing is a sociologist of education whose research is focused on racism, social inequality, and urban policy, the impact of these forces on American public schools and the lives of young people. She is a provost postdoctoral scholar at the University of Chicago. In 2018, she began working as an assistant professor in the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. Her first book, her books Ghost in the Schoolyard, Racism and School Closings on Chicago's South Side, is forthcoming from University of Chicago Press in October of this year, and explores the relationship between the closing of public schools and the structural history of housing, development, race, and racism in Chicago's Bronxville community. Professor Ewing is going to be helping to illuminate the connections between housing justice and education justice for us.
Let's give her a hand, everybody. We are also joined today by Jamie KALVEN, who is a writer and human rights activist, perhaps best known for his investigative reporting to bring the police shooting of Laquan McDonald into the light amidst entrenched denial by the mayor's administration and Chicago Police Department. Since the early 1990s, Jamie has worked in and reported from public housing communities in Chicago. He long served as advisor to the resident council of the State Ladies Garden Public Housing Development, and he currently serves under a federal consent decree as consultant to the Henry Warner Residence Committee. At Stateway Gardens, Jamie created a program of grassroots public works aimed at creating employment alternatives for ex-offenders and members of street gangs. Jamie has reported extensively on patterns of police abuse and misconduct in Chicago and was a plaintiff in KALVEN versus Chicago, in which the Illinois Appellate Court ultimately ruled that police misconduct files are public information, laying the legal groundwork for exposés such as the one around Laquan McDonald that have shaken hearts, minds, and streets in Chicago. Awards he has received for his work include the 2015 George Polk Award for local reporting, the 2016 Writing Hour Courage Prize, and the 2017 Hillman Prize. Jamie's going to share with us perspectives from decades of close observation about the relationship between racism, racial segregation, and patterns of police misconduct, abuse, and impunity. Let's give him a hand.
So we are also joined today by Daniel K. Hertz, Research Director at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, which he joined in July 2016. For those who don't know, CTBA is the independent government watchdog group that worked in partnership with SHI, Chicago Housing Initiative, to document and expose the Chicago Housing Authority's stockpile of nearly $500 million in surplus funds that were intended to provide housing for vulnerable families. Today, Daniel's work includes, but is not limited to, housing, budget, tax, and fiscal policy issues at both the state and national levels. Prior to joining CTBA, Daniel worked as a senior fellow with the City Observatory, an urban policy think tank. In that capacity, and as freelancer, he has written about urban housing development issues at outlets such as The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Planning, Chicago Magazine, The Chicago Reader. Daniel is going to share more about his research into the CHAs and financials, as well as the intersection between housing, transportation, and access to employment.
Let's give him a hand. Now you see we have two more panelists. So this is, we brought the big guns out today, everybody. So if you feel overwhelmed, it's okay. We mean to overwhelm you. That's the point here. All right? We want to overwhelm you into action. All right? So a little bit further down the line, we're going to hear from Professor Dick Simpson. He's coming from teaching the class, right?
From a civic engagement meeting, actually, but yes.
Close enough. So, you're coming from teaching class?
No. I was just making off-color jokes.
The mic is hot, so be careful. We don't want to have any special moments. So, for those of you who don't know, Professor Dick Simpson is a distinguished political science professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he began teaching in 1967. He is also a former alderman who fought successfully for numerous progressive reforms during his 2 terms in city council from 1971 to 1979, including equal pay for women in city employment and the elimination of bank redlining. We talked about redlining last go round. People know what redlining is, right? Professor Simpson has published numerous studies of elections, urban politics, voting patterns, local government, public policy, and civic budgeting. And as principal researcher, his studies have led to reforms in many units of government at the city, county, and state levels. He is the author or co-author of over 10 books on political action, ethics, and government reform, including his recently published memoir, The Good Fight, Life Lessons from a Chicago Progressive. Let's give him a hand.
All right, so last but not least, whatsoever, we are joined by journalist Maya Musoa. I'm sorry, I got so scared of that. A writer at the Chicago Reader who covers housing, policing, social justice movements, and the courts. Maya is a 3-time Social Justice News Nexus Fellow and a winner of a 2016 Lisa Gore Award for in-depth reporting about the Chicago Housing Authority. Maya's steadfast coverage of housing issues over the past several years has reinvigorated a reporting beat around housing justice issues with an investigative flair and depth and an eye for the underlying politics at play. Can we get a round of applause?
So, we're going to start with you, Professor Ewing. Now, some of you may not know, but the Kimball Oakland Community Organization cares very deeply about what's happening with our public schools. And oddly enough, I think Professor Ewing does as well. As you heard, her book that I'm anxiously awaiting, I want an autographed copy.
You got it.
Which is coming out in October, really looks at the intersection again between housing and education. So why don't you kick things off for us, if you don't mind?
Sure. So tell me if you want me to sort of talk generally just about the relationship between those things. Is that good?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right there.
You know, I'll just rant. So first of all, thank you to all the panelists. I'm really honored to be here with you today. And thank you so much to all of you, especially the people in the back that I can't see. Do you want me to stand up or speak louder?
I'm asking you to stand up so everybody can see you.
Okay, hi people in the back. Hello. Hello. I'm not very tall. So thank you all so much for being here. And I'll kick us off just by talking briefly about the relationship between segregation in public housing and segregation in public schools. So a little bit about myself. As was said in my bio, I do research on school inequality. And I used to be a CPS teacher in Bronzeville. And so when I started off on this line of research, it's not that I set out and said, I want to learn about housing or I want to understand housing. Really what I wanted to understand was why our schools are so unequal and why resources are so unfairly distributed. And specifically, I wanted to understand why the 2013 school closures were happening. At the time, I was a graduate student at Harvard, and everybody knew that I was from Chicago because, you know, Chicagoans, we like to represent ourselves very loudly. So in all times, everybody knew that I was from Chicago because I would always shout out Chicago at random times, or like Chi-Town or whatever, as we do. And so people would always come up to me and say, you know, I heard about these school closings. Why are these school closings happening? And I realized I didn't have a good answer. And the school where I taught was actually on the chopping block to be closed, and it's now been closed. And the fact that I didn't have a good answer frustrated me. And so I became obsessed with basically trying to figure it out. And in telling that story, it ended up being a housing story. Because I think what we're going to hear today about all these different areas of work is that, as I often say, segregation is kind of like the symptom. It's like the sneeze, right? And the virus is racism and white supremacy. And so oftentimes we get caught up on these specific symptoms that manifest in different ways, right? You're coughing, you're sneezing, your throat is sore. And all those things come from the same source, which is the same virus. And specifically in the case of Bronzeville, which has been the focus of my research, we really see, what bothers me is that our civic leaders often speak with an ahistoricity, right? Basically meaning pretending history never happened. And so they'll talk about things as though they just are, right? So we heard Barbara Bennett saying, black families are just leaving the South Side. Like, it just happened, right? We hear people saying things like, you know, there aren't as many black families on the West Side. They're not choosing to go to these schools anymore. Now the schools are underutilized. As though those things just happen. And I think our president gets a lot of flack for doing the same thing. He'll talk about something that you see with your own eyes as though you don't see it, right? But right here in Chicago, our leaders do the exact same thing. The thing that's really tragic to me is that, you know, just in the last several days, we've seen the exact same pattern happening with National Teachers Academy and with the schools in Englewood. And I find it extremely discouraging because I feel that America's problem is also Chicago's problem. America's problem is that we're never able, by we, I don't mean we, right, they, but America is never able to look itself in the mirror and say, this is a country founded upon the genocide of indigenous peoples. This is a country founded upon chattel slavery. This is a country that is fundamentally unequal in its DNA. So now what do we need to do that is restorative or reparative in order to address that? from jump, right? And I think that that is the same problem that Chicago has, is that we have such a deeply entrenched, multi-generational legacy of inequality that is baked into the very fabric of how the city functions, that manifests in everything the city does, from transportation to policing to housing, right? And until we have an honest conversation about that, folks are just gonna keep pretending like history never happened. And that's extraordinarily frustrating. It was very frustrating to see the parents and the children of NTA stand up and have to fight for their school as though that school was not promised to them as part of the plan for transformation, right? I went to one community meeting where a gentleman stood up and said, what's not being said is that this school was paid for by TIF dollars from black communities south of here. So this school was never y'all's to begin with, right? It's not y'all's to begin with. You are on borrowed time, and now it's being taken away. So I find that very distressing, and I feel that until we have an honest conversation about that history, we're basically never going to get anywhere. So it's so exciting that we're having those conversations here.
Prepare yourself for a leading question, okay?
Sure.
All right.
That's okay. No, I too thought it was your turn.
No, that's okay.
I'm ready for the leading question.
All right. So one thing you didn't really talk about that we all know what's happening is part of what is driving the siphoning of resources from traditional public schools, right? The teachers, the students, the money, right? Is this proliferation of privatized schools. Can you talk about just what you've uncovered in your research and your experience, any connection between the privatization of public education and the privatization of public housing?
Yes, absolutely. So we basically have moved into an era where we have been taught, and here I'm drawing heavily on the research of Pauline Littman, who's a colleague at UIC, that things like schools and things like housing are not rights, but rather they are consumer goods, right? And so they talk about schools and housing as though they were cereal, right? Like this idea of school choice basically takes the idea that a parent should pick a school the way you pick a cereal. You go to the aisle, you go to the cereal aisle, you do your research, you look at the back, you decide what flavor you want for your child, you like the nutrition facts of this school or not, and you choose a specific school. So when we say neoliberalism, which is a word people use about, that's what neoliberalism means. It's the idea that choice and markets and competition are the way that we should have our schools arranged. And in theory, this sounds very good. And actually, I feel like this is an issue that really crosses aisles, and that it's not just a white versus people of color issue, because a lot of people of color also perpetuate this idea. Which is understandable because our schools have served us so poorly for so long. So the idea of school choice, that we should step up and choose the school that is right for us, sounds very appealing. But what that leaves aside is the idea that every child should have the right to a high quality school. And that schools aren't cereal, right? That schools don't work based on a market logic, that it's not about children and families and institutions having to compete against one another, but rather how can we guarantee that every child in the city of Chicago can wake up and go to their school down the block and know that that's going to be a high quality school. And I say all the time that if you go into 42 West Madison, on the inside of the building in the lobby, it says the mission of CPS is every child, every school. Not some schools, not the schools that have a great board that's able to fundraise, not the school where they have a nice relationship with the alderman, not the child that looks cute, not the child that behaves nicely in class, not the child whose parents have the time to go fill out the application, which, by the way, as someone who's trying to navigate those applications, I've taught in CPS, I have 2 master's degrees and a doctorate, and boy, that thing is really complicated. Right? It is really hard to actually, I'm like, this PDF is really about to get the best of me, right? Having a child having a right to a high quality education shouldn't be contingent upon any of those things. And that is really the ethos of privatization, the idea that these are goods that we should choose, that we should consume on a market, and it's on us to be good consumers rather than on the state or on our leaders to make sure that everybody is provided something high quality. And I think that the same logic is really what has led us to from direct housing provision to the reliance on things like vouchers, right? Because it's the same sort of idea, that you're going to compete in a marketplace. And many people in this room know very well all the ways in which that does not work. And so I think that that is one of those examples of something where it's not just about specific policies, but actually about an ideology that is very embedded in who we are as a culture and who we are as a country, that people are like, I'm gonna get mine, and it's other people's responsibilities to get theirs. And I always say all the time, you know, because parents who send their kids to charter schools or things like that, I always say every parent has a responsibility to do what is best for their child. That is your job as a parent. As a policymaker, your job is to do what is best for every child. And those are two different imperatives. And so, you know, it's not about taking shots at charter schools or those leaders or those kids or those parents, but making our policymakers and our leaders accountable to say, what are you doing for all children, right? What are you doing for children who are in foster care? What are you doing for children who are undocumented? What are you doing for children whose parents don't speak English? What are you doing for children whose parents are dealing with addiction? All of those children also deserve high quality schools, and it shouldn't be about filling out a form and being in a lottery.
Thank you. Yeah, for real. Thank you. All right. So Jamie, it's your turn. We're going to bring.
Jamie.
Good luck.
Yeah, I'll cheer you up. I'll cheer you up.
You're up. All right. So, Jamie, you've spent decades in your career as a human rights investigator, looking closely at the social and political conditions in which abuse of certain classes of people becomes more likely or perhaps even inevitable. It's interesting to me that you began this era of your career really working with populations in public housing. Your human rights work seemed to evolve really organically from understanding the conditions public housing residents faced at Stateway Gardens and Ida B. Wells, into understanding the way the stigmatization of public housing left them vulnerable to abuse, into documenting patterns of police abuse and misconduct. Can you tell us the story of how your work evolved in this direction and any relationship you've observed between patterns of segregation and patterns of police misconduct?
So I appreciate the question. I first got involved in high-rise public housing on South State Street in the mid-90s. So before the plan for transformation, it was on the horizon. Everybody had the expectation the buildings were going to come down, but there wasn't yet an articulated policy. And I was most involved in those first years with essentially housing issues, the conditions people were living in. As was mentioned in the introduction, I started an initiative we called the Neighborhood Conservation Corps that was intended to create alternatives for primarily young men, although ultimately women joined as well, who were in the street organizations and the criminal economy, and work that they could do in the place where they lived. Out of that immersion over a number of years, I came to the issue of policing in that setting. It's not what I set out to focus on. And in truth, didn't really see how outrageous the conditions were for some time. And then when I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, and I haven't been able to since. And so what I observed over days, weeks, months, years, I was there for about 14 years, and through the entire process of the dismantling of the Stateway Gardens community and other communities across the city. So, you know, lived through the plan for transformation on the ground. And what I came to see from day to day was a spectrum of abuse, patterns of abuse, from just, you know, rudeness and use of the N-word to homicides, practices that deserve to be called torture, a great deal of just sort of daily corruption, kind of preying on and living off the drug trade. And this was a day-to-day thing, not, you know, the egregious departure from the norm that shocks us all. It was daily. And about 2000, I'm a writer by profession, but my engagement at Stateway was more as a citizen, as a neighbor. But when the plan for transformation started, with a couple of colleagues, we began a process of human rights documentation of this amazing thing that was going on, driven by public policy, on an immense scale and with accelerating speed, looked at in historical terms. And we published from a vacant unit in one of the high-rises at Stateway Gardens, a web publication we called The View from the Ground. And my work then and now, I think, and Eve said something that sort of evoked this, has always been addressed to attacking the disconnect between policy discourse, a kind of frictionless realm of policy discourse, whether about public housing or about police reform, that is just disconnected from observable reality on the ground. So really the work was based on recruiting reality and describing conditions in places nobody ever came to, including the press. And if you describe the high-rise public housing that has now radically disappeared from our city as abandoned communities, and I always insist on that term, there's a way that sociologists and then kind of journalists in their parasitic way, I speak as one, always use this formulation of isolated urban poverty. Well, it's completely a misstatement of the reality. These are not isolated places. It's not like the poor pulled up stakes and moved away from the rest of us. These are abandoned communities. Stateway Gardens was an extraordinary representation of that, as were a number of developments. Stateway is the one I know best. 35th to 39th, State Street to the Dan Ryan, said on the basis of the 1990 census to be the single, I'm sure it had competition, but somebody looked at census tracts and designated Stateway Gardens the single poorest community in the country. Across 35th Street, IIT. Across the expressway, what I grew up knowing as Comiskey Park, I can't even remember what the name of it is, but that place where the White Sox play baseball. As of 2000, a block and a half away from the administrative headquarters of the Chicago Police Department, block and a half away from De La Salle High School, where Mayor Daley I and Mayor Daley II and many other, luminaries went to school. In those years, in the 90s, you had a kind of reviving Brownsville community, not isolated, abandoned. I think a really, really critical notion in how we think about this. And it was also, well, I don't want to take up too much time, but it was also high-rise public housing in those pre-apocalyptic years of utter abandonment was the epitome of segregation in a hyper-segregated city. This might as well, in the middle of this intimate landscape with these vast social distances, these communities might as well have been on the other side of the moon in terms of how they were perceived. And everybody here, I suspect, has at least memories and impressions of the concentrations of public housing on the South Side. You couldn't go anywhere on the expressways that sort of functioned as moats around these developments without seeing the high-rises, even 60 miles an hour on the Dan Ryan at the periphery of your vision, and yet they were radically and completely elsewhere in people's moral imaginations and their imaginations of the city. So, I began this process of documentation. We focused on the relocation process, on conditions in the building, but then increasingly the policing and public safety conditions became my personal focus. And I feel grateful in many ways for that experience and perspective, and for having started kind of at that end of the process. When I say human rights reporting, what I fundamentally mean is a kind of reporting that focuses on particular blows administered by particular hands to particular bodies. Nothing abstract about it. Nothing, we have all this language we use in the police reform space. We use language like impunity, accountability, transparency. These are really, really useful words, but they can also just move around here in this sort of mid-level, weightless, abstract zone. And what the immersion at Stateway gave me over years, and then bringing whatever my skill set is as a reporter to bear, was a sense that, and we can come back to this from another direction, that the structures of racial inequality, the structures of exclusion in our city are enforced at bedrock by blows from particular hands against particular bodies. Nothing abstract about it. So, I had the experience of witnessing, before I knew what the word impunity meant, but it wasn't a part of my regular vocabulary. And over a period of years, I witnessed what impunity looks like, how people who are disposed to be abusive behave when they're in a position to toy with other people, when they know that they are not subject to being identified, if identified, not investigated or disciplined. And the question formed after a couple of years, several years of doing this kind of reporting, always oriented on the lived experience of the victim. The question formed, how would the world have to be organized for what I know to be the reality to be true? What set of institutional arrangements would have to exist for what we had thoroughly documented to be the case? And that really was the start of, there have been multiple currents that have fed into this moment in Chicago with respect to policing and public safety. But from Stateway Gardens, working with civil rights lawyers at the University of Chicago's Mandel Clinic, we began to bring civil rights suits on behalf of residents. And in the course of those suits, and with my sort of parallel reporting, we pursued this question of what are the institutional conditions that enable and then shield these obvious patterns of abuse that you just are so observable. And that, I won't take you through a decade of litigation. It was a long, winding road. But that culminated in 2014 in a decision in which I was the plaintiff, KALVEN versus Chicago, that established that police misconduct files, documents pertaining to police misconduct, are public information in Illinois, a level of transparency that exists in very few jurisdictions across the country. I'll close in a minute, but I want to make one observation about the present moment. A lot has flowed from the breaking down the walls of official secrecy around policing in Chicago, and more will come. And the press became very interested in all of this, I tried for years to get other reporters to come in on the story of abuse of this vulnerable population and the utter impunity in the shadow of the police headquarters. Nobody was interested. Where people became interested is when it became this thing about official secrecy and what are they hiding, and that was the kind of story the press could tell. To this day, there is very little, with a few notable exceptions, very, very little interest in the press in the underlying conditions that were the impetus for this reporting. So I feel, some of you may be aware of a big story I did recently called The Code of Silence, about conditions at Ida B. Wells with a group of gang tactical officers under a Sergeant Watts who were an integral part of the drug trade. But one aspect of that was they constantly framed people who didn't cooperate with them. There's been now, you read it recurrently in the papers, and it will go on indefinitely, a parade of exonerations. In November of last year, 15 people were exonerated in the biggest group exoneration in the history of Cook County coming out of that story. We've gotten tremendous attention. A feature film is going to be made based on the Code of Silence story. And I still feel like we haven't broken the story. We have not broken the story. People do not comprehend the human rights disaster that the policing and public safety in public housing, particularly in those last years, represents. And to go to the language Eve used, until we can acknowledge those realities, until we can give a full accounting of that, we can't make much progress on these issues.
Right, thank you, Jamie. This is good. So we're going to come back to you. Want to get Daniel in here real quick. So I think a lot of people in the audience probably know that the Chicago Housing Authority got busted for hiding, on average, $100 million on an annual basis, right? People heard this story? It got up to, yeah, people nodding their heads, yeah, they got busted. And so the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability was very helpful in really helping us to break that story, to use Jamie's term, right? Now, I personally want to give credit to Leah and to Michael Jeet, intern who worked with Leah, who poured through the financial records of the Chicago Housing Authority year after year after year, where they had inconsistencies in the numbers within the same year, so clearly they weren't even reading the reports they were publishing. But it revealed a pattern. And they, Leah, raise your hand for the people who don't know. They uncovered this pattern of money that was just coming up missing. Like, you couldn't tell where it was going. You saw it go in, but you didn't see it go out. But every year they were reporting to HUD, they were spending every single penny. Right? So the Chicago Housing Authority, under Mayor Rahm Emanuel, was intentionally defrauding the federal government. Now, of course, because of clout, right? I probably shouldn't be saying this, should I? That's my boss today, so I'm looking. All right, okay. So the top fundraiser for the Democratic Party is running a major city committing fraud. Like, how is that not a scandal?
Yeah, right.
I mean, seriously, how is that not a scandal? And then he says to us in a meeting, he literally got on a plane, flew to DC to meet with, I guess it was Castro at the time, right? Julian Castro was the Secretary of HUD. Met with the Secretary of HUD to convince him not to take the money back, that they got busted, they were stealing. And then flies back here to Chicago and says, look, I can't pass a law that's going to have me having to go through this again. We don't need accountability here. We have accountability, I'm going to get in trouble. This is what he said. It's like, how are you united behind bars, man? It's just, anyway, okay. So I'm supposed to be bringing Daniel in, right?
You got it already. You're doing
Right. So Daniel and the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability took the work that Leah and Michael Jeet had done over the, like, 3 or 4 years, went back through the numbers again using publicly available information, and said, wow, CHA is stealing money. And again, it still wasn't clear what was happening. But what they were able, I'm doing your job. Okay, so Daniel, everybody, give him a hand.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you all for having me here. And yeah, I mean, I do want to start by acknowledging the work that Leah, and even before me, the first report on this, that CTBA has done 2 reports on this. The first one came out before I was with them, and most of the work on that from the CTBA side was done by a woman named Amanda Cass, who's now at the University of Chicago, and I want to acknowledge her work on this too. So yeah, so basically the issue was, and Juanza covered a lot of this already, but I'll go through it quickly. That people noticed that every year the CHA was saying that they were spending more money than they got in, right? And I should say the vast majority of the money that they're getting is coming from Washington, D.C., from the Housing and Urban Development. So every year they say they're spending more money than they're taking in. At the same time, they're saying that the amount of money that they have in reserves is going up substantially, right? Reaching, I believe in 2012, about $430 million. Now that doesn't really make any sense, right? It doesn't make sense that if you spend more than you get, that the amount of money you have left over is going up. And so I won't get into too much detail, but essentially it boiled down to accounting gimmicks. They were doing something, they were essentially saying that they were spending this money on non-cash outlays. A non-cash outlay, as it sounds like, doesn't involve any cash. It doesn't actually involve giving that money out. And so they were able to use that trick to basically show that their bottom line was in the red while stockpiling this cash. And specifically, the cash that they were stockpiling was money that the federal government was giving them for housing vouchers. So each year in this period, the Chicago Housing Authority was funded to give out about 50,000 housing vouchers. The amount of money that they were not spending was equivalent to about 13,000 housing vouchers a year, right? And this is at a time when, you know, their waiting list is pushing 100,000 households, right? 100,000 families. And a big chunk of those people, right, 13,000 every year, could have been receiving assistance if they had spent this money that they had. You know, and even more so at the same time, right, they're going through, Jamie KALVEN referenced the plan for transformation. They had committed to building or rebuilding 25,000 units of hard units of public housing, actual physical public housing. They were thousands of units behind on that. That was, again, as I said, that was supposed to be done by 2009. It's now 2018. I just actually was rereading their reports today. They say they're almost there. They're going to do it this year.
This is the year.
This is the year. Every year has been the year. It's like the Cubs pre-2016. Every year has been the year since 2009. So yeah, so they built up this reserve of $430 million. The federal government, now, you know, they should have some money in the bank, right? It's responsible to have some money in the bank, and HUD has a recommended level, which is $120 million. So they had 4 times the recommended amount. And as Joanza sort of alluded to, there were some concerns originally that they had so much money that the federal government might actually take some of it back. And Chicago, if that had happened, Chicago just would have been out possibly hundreds of millions of dollars that was supposed to go to low-income families and seniors to create or afford affordable housing. So that report, that sort of first phase, that report came out in 2014. Last year, we published a follow-up report, and that basically said 2 things. Number one, they still have a bunch of money in the bank. It's gone down by some amount. Last year it went down to, I believe, $360 million. In the most recent year, it's gone down again to in the 200s, which is again, you know, more than double what the recommended reserve amount is. And they also they increased their what's called the voucher utilization rate. So the percentage of vouchers that they're funded for, that they're actually giving out, up to about 90%, right? So they're not giving out 5,000 or 6,000. But we also documented that what was some of the stuff they had done with that reserve money, right? That had been spent down. One of the things that they did was they paid off their own debt early, right? So the Chicago Housing Authority, like lots of other governments, takes out bonds, right? It takes out loans to build housing in their case. right? That's a normal thing to do, a responsible thing to do. So they had about $225 million worth of these bond debt that was sitting around that one might assume they were going to use to build some of the 25,000 units of public housing that they had not yet built. Instead of doing that, in 2012, the CHA used some of those reserves, again, essentially voucher money. They used vouchers to pay off debt. And we have asked them why they did that, and they don't have a great answer. And we can't really tell whether, if anybody else has an update on this, I would love to know, because I haven't asked them for a little bit. But it was sort of within the office, it was sort of a debate about how much of this was malice and how much was just incompetence. How much is they just literally don't know because they've had so much turnover that by this point nobody can tell you what happened 5 years ago. But in any case, they did spend this money. We know that for sure. They spent about $200 million paying off debt. One excuse they can give is, well, if you have less debt, you have less interest payments, right? So they've saved some money on that side. Except that according to their own figures, the interest that they saved, I believe, added up to something like $2 to $3 million a year. CHA's annual budget is $1 billion a year. 2 to 3 million is, they could lose that, and we'd be fortunate if somebody caught them. So essentially, so that was sort of the takeaway, right? Which is, the sort of it's not the end, because they still have a very unusually large reserve, right? But the end of sort of part of this reserve story is 13,000 people a year lost out on their affordable housing. And the Chicago Housing Authority paid down some debt that they probably should have used to build public housing. And that's where we are now.
So I got a leading question for you, Daniel. I'm a little speechless, right? So I knew all this, right? Like I'm like still in Daniel's thunder here, and still it's just hearing it is just sad. So can you share how they can get away with this? Like, I'm assuming this is quasi-legal, right?
It's shockingly legal. So it really goes back to a program called Moving to Work, which is sort of actually continuing conversation that Eve began with, sort of neoliberalism, market logic, charter schools. I kind of think of Moving to Work as like charter schools for public housing authorities, because essentially what it did was it said, now normally if you're not in Moving to Work, if you're a housing authority, the federal government gives you money in several buckets, and you can only use money from a certain bucket for a certain use. So, for example, they would give you one bucket for hard units, physical public housing buildings, to take care of them, to build them. They'll give you a separate bucket for vouchers. That money can only be used for vouchers. Under Moving to Work, and the Chicago Housing Authority is a Moving to Work authority, under Moving to Work, the housing authority gets just one big bag of cash, and it can essentially use that money as it sees fit. The theory being, if you're on the ground at a particular housing authority, you know better, right? You can choose to use that money better. You can use that flexibility. You can use that flexibility to sort of be more nimble and have choice and sort of improve outcomes that way. In practice, as we've seen, the Chicago Housing Authority used that flexibility to hoard people's voucher money and spend it on their own internal purposes for benefits that they can't even explain. But sort of to get back to your question, what that means is the way that the Moving to Work was written was so broad and so vague and had so few accountability measures worked into it that it becomes impossible to hold an authority like the Chicago Housing Authority accountable for misusing these funds, because under the rules of the contract that they signed, it's not clear that they're misusing the funds. Right now, under any sort of like third party, is this a moral, ethical thing to do? Is this a good government thing to do, right? It's ridiculous, of course this isn't. But legally, under the contract that they signed with HUD, it's not clear that can be enforced. That contract was going to expire. It was a 10-year contract, I believe, and that was going to expire. And there was sort of talk around, not just in Chicago, but nationally, talk around sort of working some accountability metrics, working more sort of avenues to hold public housing authorities accountable into moving to work. Unfortunately, in the 2016 federal budget, a rider was attached that automatically renewed all moving to work contracts without changes for another 10 years. And so that option was taken off the table for the CHA. And so we're stuck in a situation now, again, for another decade, in which they have the authority, again, it's like a charter public housing authority. They get public money. They have the authority to use it almost however they want. And it's very difficult to come up with a legal way to hold them accountable for it.
Thank you, Daniel. And just quickly, if you could just, question from the audience came, the years that you studied this?
The years of the voucher?
CHA, yeah, that they were
so
hoarding the money. What years were those?
So the main years in which they were building up the reserves was, I believe, 2008 to 2012. And then starting in 2012, they paid off a bunch of the debt, and then in the last couple of years, that reserve amount has started to fall, and again, it went from about 4 times the recommended amount to now about 2 times the recommended amount, but as of 2016.
Yep, come back in here. The human rights investigator needs to say something about this garbage.
Well, that's actually, there's an earlier chapter, again, facilitated by Moving to Work, when, as people will recall, in the 90s, the Housing Authority was basically seized by the federal government, taken over in a kind of receivership by HUD for multiple myriad failures to perform its function on behalf of residents. As the city sort of renegotiated after a period of, I think, three or 4 years in HUD receivership, as they sort of renegotiated, got the Housing Authority back, that's when the Moving to Work kicks in, and the plan for transformation is articulated as a policy. The public rationales at that time are that we're going to end the isolation of public housing. The public housing residents are citizens of the city. They have the same rights as other citizens. And that became the rationale for a huge division of the spoils. So out of that pot of money for which they're not accountable for their allocations, huge transfers were made over more than a decade, notably to the Chicago Police Department. While these really catastrophic public safety conditions are prevailing in the developments, I believe, I don't have exact totals, but for the decade before they started hoarding, it's 150 million, maybe more than that. It depends on how you calculate it, that is transferred from HUD money coming to serve public housing tenants to the Chicago Police Department. Similarly with the Department of Aging, other agencies, all in the name of inclusion, while their abandonment is being perfected through the plan for transformation. So that's the sort of earlier chapter that the hoarding then follows.
Thank you. Thank you both. So just to reiterate, we have cards. We'd love to hear the questions. Just hand them into the people wearing the SHI shirts, the Chicago Housing Initiative shirts. So to recap, we've talked about intersections now between different justice issues: housing and education, housing and policing, housing and transportation, housing and employment. So now we want to move on to the theme of politics, with the goal here being to start to understand how the city's segregation itself shapes political life. Does the city's segregation shape dynamics inside city council? Does it shape electoral politics in Chicago? And how has this stayed the same or changed across different administrations and eras in Chicago's history? So everyone we have with us today, Professor Dick Simpson. There's probably no better expert in the city of Chicago who has studied political dynamics in our city across the Daley administration, the Harold Washington administration, the two Daley administrations, right? Let's not forget the second one, right? And the Emanuel administration. So, Professor Simpson, this is an intentionally broad question. What can you tell us about how Chicago's segregation shapes Chicago politics? Also, just to reiterate, if some people in the back are having trouble hearing, we had to sacrifice one speaker for a mic, I believe. So if you could please project, even though you have a
I'll
mic.
do my best. They wouldn't even give me a microphone in city council, so I think it'll be okay. You know, I'm tempted to say, well, race and politics have nothing to do with each other in Chicago, but that, of course, isn't true. Race and politics was absolutely intertwined since before the Civil War. So it's a little over 150 years we've been on this track so far that has yielded all of these grand, wonderful results that have already been told to you. I don't want to go back quite to the Civil War. I don't think that will help you, but if you remember, the so-called Black Belt came into existence at that time when blacks came up from the South or wherever they came from and they got off at the station over here. They would literally take their suitcase or whatever and walk a few blocks going south, and that created the first ghetto, and then later we were blessed with a second ghetto on the west side for much of the same reasons, because the city was segregated. And the politics followed that segregation. But I'm going to jump forward to the Richard J. Daley administration, because particularly on public housing, that's where the story begins. We didn't have significant public housing until laws were passed in 1948, but it was Richard J. Daley that created the public housing system and the alderman at the time. Now, the amazing thing about that is Daley lost his 1955 election in the white vote. Daley was only elected because of the black vote. And yet, within a couple of years, as they started to decide, the public housing people, the staff, said, well, we've got a good plan for public housing. What we will do is scattered site, integrated public housing scattered all over the city of Chicago. It'll be in every neighborhood, and there'll be access to services, there'll be access to jobs. Gee, what do you think the white alderman in the city council had to say about that idea, other than Linda Prey? Linda Prey was described as the only black alderman in the city council representing the black community, when there were the Silent Six who were actually of color. But they were just rubber stamping whatever came along in the Richard J. Daley administration. So the end result, if the white alderman wouldn't take it, and Daley had to go with the white alderman to stay in power in his view, he had to make a choice. He chose the whites. What that ended up doing was concentrating all the public housing, as we know, in places like Robert Taylor Homes and Cabrini Green and so forth, all the big high-rise buildings. And they were all in the Black Belt, except for Cabrini Green, which was in a black section on the north side and so forth. Okay, so that gets us to the Richard J. Daley and the segregation that happened then. I've been an expert witness in nearly every gerrymandering case that has occurred about city council wards since 1970. And what we found is, as an expert witness, I testified in court and was never contradicted, although the city tried mightily to do so. Gee, there's a difference with how black aldermen and white aldermen and Latino aldermen vote. Unfortunately, not as big a difference as you might wish, because there's some, let's call Uncle Toms, that were part of this who, like the Silent Six, still would go with the mayor. But segregation did make a difference. And the voting, most of you were alive in the Harold Washington period. You know that people voted according to race, as well as in the electorate, not just in the city council. Now, fast forward again from Harold Washington and the first Daley to the Richard M. Daley and Rahm Emanuel administrations. As you've heard, the policy called the Plan for Transformation was essentially to knock down 25,000 units of family public housing. And oh, gee, we sort of forgot we were supposed to build the replacement housing. We're still waiting for the replacement housing. It's supposed to be, again, this wonderful plan. We're going to have mixed unit housing. Everybody will live together happily. There'll be private housing and affordable housing and public housing in the same buildings. And the only difficulty is, of course, we're still waiting for HUD to use its millions of dollars and the private sector to contribute to make that possible. So the politics is still important. And in the city council, there are two caucuses that might help you with the questions of both public housing, affordable housing, policing, and all those kinds of things. There is the Black Caucus, which on good days does represent some of the black community. And there's the Progressive Caucus, which more often represents the justice interests of the city. Now, the city council is still a rubber stamp. It was a rubber stamp under Richard J. Daley, it was a rubber stamp under Richard M. Daley, and it's a rubber stamp under Rahm Emanuel. It votes and divided roll call votes when there's something at stake and people are disagreeing, still votes on average 90% of the time with Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel has yet to lose a single vote in the city council. Now, he has made deals behind the scenes to modify some legislation. The aldermen talk about how wonderful it is. They talked to the mayor and convinced him to modify this or that. And you can judge, based on the policy discussion with charter schools and public housing and so forth, how well that's worked out for everybody. So I'm sure I'll get asked in a minute what to do about all of this, but I'll give you a hint. There are 2019 elections. And if we do not act in the 2019 elections, you're going to get the same policies again.
Thank you.
I think he needs another hand for that one. 2019, you said?
Yeah.
2019, y'all?
2018.
Take out the trash.
Well, 2018 solves the Trump problem. It doesn't solve the Rahm Emanuel problem.
All right. So let's keep going here. We want to try to leave some time for a Q&A. We want to bring in a dear friend of mine, one of the few reporters in this city who's writing about rent control before J.B. Pritzker started talking about it. So Ma's a journalist. You write a lot about housing issues.
Yeah.
Things have to look pretty bleak from where you sit most of the time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to round this out with Maya. Then there's a ton of questions that have come in from you, the audience. We're going to try to get to those as best we can. But Maya, there's a war simmering on the northwest side of this city around the issues that we've talked about. We have this resurgence of people on the city council attempting to block publicly funded housing going into Jefferson Park. Yeah, it's happening right now. So can you just share kind of what you've observed in that fight and as it connects to some of the other stories you've seen happen around the city?
Yeah, so actually I'll make a little parallel connection first. When it comes to this whole history of the Plan for Transformation and the Moving to Work program, of which the CHA is a part of, that is this sort of deregulation agreement with the federal government that allows the CHA to do whatever it wants with the money that it gets. I think it's very interesting that the CHA is even in a moving to work agreement with the federal government, because the origins of that program, as it was developed in the 90s, was that only very high functioning, well-managed public housing authorities were supposed to be in this program. Now, as Jamie mentioned, the CHA was in federal receivership in the 90s, which is basically like it's hit rock bottom in terms of mismanagement and corruption, where the federal government says, like, we're taking away the keys, you don't get to run this thing anymore, we don't trust you. So how is it that magically we go from being in federal receivership until 1999 to getting not just the keys back, but basically being able to do whatever you want with the car within a year? And the answer is basically really effective political moves by Richard M. Daley, the son, who went to Washington and convinced Bill Clinton basically to allow the CHA to join the Moving to Work program. But Bill Clinton was a lame duck president at the time, and January 2000 comes around, we've got a new Republican president, which is a big problem for Daley because he thinks that now there's a threat to the CHA staying in this Moving to Work program. So he goes back to Washington again, and this is like a story that I love, that he tells George W. Bush that the CHA really, really needs to stay in this program, and the reason being is because it's going to allow the city of Chicago to help public housing residents rebuild their souls. Not just rebuild public housing, but to rebuild their souls. And we all know that that Bush was a pretty religious dude, so he really liked the sound of that. So anyway, that's how we ended up in the program, which we had no business being in the first place. So back to your question about the Northwest Side and what's been going on there. Basically, it's an interesting example of what happens in Chicago politically when the issue at hand is not a mayoral initiative. So the mayor doesn't really care about 100-unit development in the 41st Ward or in Jefferson Park, but we've got two stories going on up there that have a very interesting kind of political dynamics. So in Jefferson Park, which ward is that, Arena? 45th. Okay, so in this was about a year ago. Alderman Arena, who is part of the Progressive Caucus, decided to introduce the community to a new plan that he was getting behind to build a 100-unit building right next to the Jefferson Park Blue Line that would have 80% of the units would be affordable housing, if I'm remembering correctly, and a lot of it would be ADA accessible. The developer, Full Circle Communities, was planning to really prioritize families with children and veterans. So the demographics, people with disabilities, particularly those who are wheelchair bound, veterans and people with children, like people who have the hardest time finding affordable housing in the city of Chicago, would have been prioritized in that development. And on top of that, Jefferson Park is a neighborhood that has tons of people who are already paying more than 30% of their income in housing, which means their housing is not affordable, and who are veterans, and who are people with disabilities, and who have families, and could qualify for this housing. So Alderman Arena held a meeting in the beginning of February of 2017. At which he rolled out this plan, and this meeting was just in this church in Jefferson Park, and it was packed with people, white people. I saw one non-white face in that room of maybe like at least 200 people, who were very, very angry that there was an affordable housing a development within affordable housing coming to the neighborhood. And there was also an angry mob that was gathered outside, people chanting no Section 8, all kinds of other hateful stuff. A lot of folks here, I think, were maybe there outside of the church that night. It was like a pretty scary scene. There was one woman who was holding a sign that said, Cabrini started as veterans housing too, as this like weird, ominous threat that like, next thing you know, Jefferson Park is gonna be the new Cabrini Green or something like that. Like that was like the tone of the protest. And while Alderman Arena and the developers from Full Circle tried to present very kind of, they tried to keep an even keel and just tell people information about what the plan was for this development, people were just like not having it. And so after that, you had a kind of swell of activity, community kind of organizing, negative community organizing against this development, as well as a lot of positive community organizing, the people who were fighting to get this development built. And the process has stalled in a place where it's still possible that this building will get built, but there's so much community opposition that the city powers that be, the various entities that are like the Department of Planning and Development and other city entities that are technically answerable to the mayor, like they are not working to help build this development. And at the same time as this whole thing was going on with this building in Jefferson Park that was only going to be 100 units and 7 stories tall, there was a much bigger development that was being proposed in the 41st Ward, right near O'Hare in Alderman Napolitano's ward. And that building was supposed to have like 300 units, and only 30 of them were going to be affordable housing. So in compliance with the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, which is the city law that says if you're like building a new development, you're supposed to allocate 10% of your units for affordable housing, most developers don't do that. They just pay a fee instead, which goes into the city pot that supposedly gets used to build affordable housing, but it like doesn't really. So this developer, who's like a luxury developer, these guys actually decided we're going to keep these units on site. So it's an unusual move in full compliance with the letter and spirit of the Affordable Requirements Ordinance to build this building. And these people had already got their approval from the Department of Planning and Development. They were moving along in the process to get their required zoning approvals, and then this whole like scandal happens in Jefferson Park around the affordable housing building. And people in the 41st Ward, who are Alderman Napolitano's constituents, start contacting the alderman to voice their opposition to this building that they had previously supported, that they had no issue with at all. Like nobody had ever expressed at any of the public meeting any opposition to this 300-unit building that would have 30 affordable housing units. And citing the upswell of opposition in Jefferson Park, Alderman Napolitano, who also once on paper supported this building, started saying that he didn't want it built anymore. And he started sending emails to the Department of Planning and Development saying that he doesn't want this building to get its approval. The DPD said, well, that's really not up to you. Like, we have to have this hearing about this building. And they did, and they gave it the green light, and it moved to the Zoning Commission. Then Alderman Napolitano started sending angry emails to the people on the Zoning Commission, asking them to not vote on this, that he wasn't in support of the building. And a funny thing happened there. So the Zoning Commission was supposed to vote on the building, and then the full City Council, and that's kind of the process. If you want to build something, you have to take it step by step through DPD, then the Zoning Commission, then the full City Council, and then you can start, tearing up the ground. So the Zoning Commission was supposed to have a vote on this building. And Alderman Napolitano wrote to all of the members saying that they didn't want that that he didn't want that to happen. The day that the hearing on the building was held, he came in and delivered some remarks saying that he was against this. The lawyers from who represented the developer were completely taken aback by this, because as far as they were concerned, everything was going fine. And then the chairman of the Zoning Committee, Alderman Solis, called a recess, took all the aldermen out of the chamber, off of the public record, and they came back 15 minutes later, postponed the hearing, and never, in the months that followed, ever motioned it back up again. So January came around, the approval from the Department of Planning and Development became null and void because 6 months had passed since it was given. And the City Council, the full City Council, never voted on this thing. So basically, this apartment building is not going to get built anymore because the local alderman decided that he didn't want that kind of development in his ward. And the moral of the story here is that, like, basically, if the mayor doesn't have a stake in whatever kind of development is going on in an alderman's ward, an alderman can decide whether or not the development will actually happen. And there's such a notion as aldermanic prerogative, which basically is something that aldermen say is the reason behind them not voting against their peers when it comes to developments in their ward. So there were people that were on the Planning Commission and the Zoning Committee who are technically in support of affordable housing, like Alderman Tunney, like some other people who are frequently quoted as saying that they want more affordable housing. And but in a context where they would have to go up against a colleague and say, hey, maybe we should actually build this building in your ward, here are all the benefits it would bring, they're nowhere to be heard from. So the whole kind of dynamic between the mayor and the alderman, it sort of disappears when you have a situation where the mayor doesn't really care about the issue and nothing is at stake for him. And instead of this rubber stamp situation where you've got all the aldermen falling in line and approving whatever it is that the mayor wants, you have this sort of something that's on the opposite end of the spectrum, which is this weird petty tribalism and sort of people disintegrating into their own little fiefdoms and making planning decisions that are completely not don't have the interest of the wider city in mind, which is a very weird way to plan a city. So
Yeah. So thank you. I was actually there that night. I was outside of that church, and it was a horrifying experience. As a member of our very astute audience pointed out, we actually skipped over transportation. Because we're kind of running behind. So Daniel, if you could please quickly touch on, because we're housing people, right? Can you define transportation equity for us all? And then talk about the status today of where affordable housing exists and where it doesn't exist, if you could. Can you do that a little?
Really quickly, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
quickly.
so I'll try to do it really quickly. So I think of transportation sort of as the cost of participating in society, right? I mean, you can't participate in society fully, whether that means going to work, going to school, seeing your friends, going to a play, going grocery shopping, or whatever, unless you can move around the city. And so for me, transportation equity would mean that you can participate in society in that way without sort of exorbitant costs in terms of money or in terms of time or in terms of dignity. The situation that was not great. And largely because of things that we've been talking about today. So, the plan for transformation, in addition to simply displacing lots of people, in particular, it displaced people in places that were, even if they were in many ways socially and economically abandoned, were actually physically quite close to places. Right. 35th and State is not very far away from the Loop. And so, the plan for transformation actually eliminated almost 6,000 units of public housing near L stations, near transit, right? 6,000. And that is a large reason why Chicago is the only metropolitan area in the country with a old, robust public transit system, relatively robust public transit system, where actually the proportion of housing close to that transit, close to public transit, is actually declining, right? So in New York, in DC, and Boston, the proportion of housing close to transit is increasing. In Chicago, it's been decreasing, and the plan for transformation was a huge part of that. The other point, I was looking up some statistics before I came here, and I promise I'll wrap up quickly. But
No.
But I think I think often when we think of inequity in transportation, right, we think about people who either really cannot at all afford to buy a car to drive, or are physically unable to drive, being forced to expend huge amounts of time, energy, simply getting to work, getting to school, living their daily lives, and that's absolutely a huge part of it. But I also wanted to bring up, another side of it is huge numbers of people in Chicago and elsewhere sort of get around this issue by purchasing transportation that they can't actually afford. And, you know, we think of sort of carless households as being correlated with income. If you look at a map, if you look at sort of a map of the Chicago region, where people have cars, where they don't, it's far more correlated with, do you live close to public transit, right? And even deeply low income areas, deeply disinvested areas that are far from public transit, many of the people who live there find a way to scrounge up and buy and operate a car at huge opportunity cost to housing, to groceries, to medicine. And so just really quickly as that, I was looking at two places in particular, Boys Town in Lakeview and Roseland. Around Boys Town, the average income is $80,000 a year. In Roseland, it was $27,000. In Boys Town, fewer people in Boys Town have cars than in Roseland, even though the average income is $50,000 a year higher. And they actually spend less money on transportation. People in Boys Town spend an average of $7,700 a year on transportation. In Roseland, it's over $10,000, right? That's a tax and an unaffordability, right? You know, some people might say, well, look at this location, right? The rent in Roseland is certainly cheaper than rent in Lakeview, but the cost of the location, because transportation is so bad there, the full cost of the location can be worse.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we've talked about how the problems intersect. So I want to go one by one down the panel and hear about where do you see intersections on the solutions?
So I'll start. I will say the hard one and then the easy one. I think something Jamie said that I wrote down, he said that even though people were passing the State Street corridor every day, that they saw people living in affordable housing as radically and completely elsewhere in their moral imagination. And I think that one thing that intersects about all of these issues is our society's deep fear of Black people and deep contempt and hatred for poor people. And the intersections of those two things leads to an utter disregard for fellow human beings, which I think is why it's so important that Jamie is bringing in a human rights framework, right? That is the thing that keeps me up at night, to be quite honest. I don't know how to get our society to stop hating people for being poor. And I feel like the only thing I can think about in terms of a solution for that, and that's why I said that was the hard one, I'll do the easier one next. I'll do the easier one next, but once upon a time, talking directly about poverty and a war on poverty was a viable political strategy and considered a moral imperative. And I feel like that is the rhetorical, I'm a big believer in like talk and rhetoric and how our rhetoric drives our fight, right? I think that needs to be the center of our fight. I think we need to talk about poverty as being morally unconscionable in a wealthy nation, as being morally unconscionable in a city where we're talking about job breaks for everybody from Amazon to the Obama Center to $95 million for a police whatever, right? All of those things, everything needs to come back to, okay, but why do we have people living in poverty? Why do we have people living under the viaduct? Why? It's just, that is to me is everything. So that's the one solution I think is like recentering our rhetoric around that question, because everything comes back to that. And the okey doke is to try to get you to think about all the other things and like overwhelm us with all of these bad, like these are 5 different bad problems. This is actually, to me, one problem. So that's the hard problem. And the hard solution. The comparatively easy one, which is still actually hard, is so we've been talking about all these different institutions. The CHA is totally jacked up. The CPS is totally jacked up, right? CPD is totally jacked up. One person appoints the bosses and the people in charge of all of these institutions, right? One guy, and right, it is the mayor. And so, my work is about Barbara Byrd Bennett conducting governmental malfeasance, and now she's doing the time because she did the crime, but the person who appoints her, who now has had 2 of his 4 superintendents, CEOs, now have to step down because of corruption, is like unscathed. Eugene Jones is the person who oversaw a lot of this stuff at the Chicago Housing Authority, also unilaterally appointed by the mayor, no kind of checks and balances process. When I wrote about that in the New Republic, people in Canada said, y'all got Eugene Jones? He was up here doing bad stuff. How y'all? We assumed he was in jail, right? When I write about Barbara Bird Bennett, people in Detroit and Cleveland say, oh, y'all got Barbara Bird Bennett. We didn't even know she just floated downriver, right? I mean, McCarthy, right? Everything with Laquan McDonald, McCarthy at least got fired, right? But that same level of accountability, that was the first time that people were like, hey, if you appoint this guy, if you're an executive leader who claims to be worthy of all this unilateral authoritarian power, then you need to be accountable when your people mess up. Until we get to elect people in these positions, then if you're going to deny me my right as a citizen to have a voice and a representative election, then you need to pay the price when you appoint these people. And if not, you don't get to be mayor. So that's the easy solution. The easy solution is that even in 2019, it can't just be about one person versus another person, whoever a viable opposition ends up being, but actually about how do we change the terms so that whoever is mayor either has to give us an elected voice or swear on record to be accountable for the people that they appoint.
Thank you. Jamie?
Well, I want to start by endorsing everything Eve's just said. You know, a couple of thoughts from the policing perspective. One thing that really dramatically drove the plan for transformation, and that we didn't talk about before, we kind of implied, was what I think of as the criminalization of places. We have criminalized places, and wretched predatory policing, this combination of not coming when somebody makes a 911 call and then coming to prey on communities, particularly the drug trade, that dreadful combination actually there's this sort of dreadful synergy of these different things that produces a perception of these communities that should be seen as being victimized by state policy and by both affirmative policy and by abuse. We see them as criminal places. We criminalize communities. The demolitions of public housing weren't simply acts of dismantling structures. They were erasures of places. They were the creation of a vacant lot because of that narrative of criminal places. And I think, thinking about first the immense costs of that, the criminalization of places, and hence the creation of, certainly in public housing and in high-rise public housing, of a cap. It's inadequate to talk in terms of race or class, in terms of how stigmatized people were. And one of the things that I've come to that comes back to Eve's notion of one big problem and needing to keep that in focus and to construct a public discourse about a range of outcomes that keeps that one big problem in the center is a lot of my work around policing has had to do with getting information and then analyzing information about the oversight, supervision, internal investigation, disciplinary structures, which it isn't even right to say that they're broken. They actually largely have been performing the function that they were given, which is to make the grievances of black and brown people disappear. And they're dedicated to sort of not connecting the dots, and there are lots and lots of improvements to be made there, because those are major sources of impunity for that subset of the police department or of other institutions, but we're talking about the police department right now, that given the opportunity will be abusive, whatever that means. Corruption, outright racism, wretched behavior towards women, pleasure in physical cruelty, whatever it is, they'll gravitate to those spaces. And the broken systems, the dysfunctional systems, confer impunity. They know they won't get caught. They won't get. But what I've learned over the years, and what for me is the one big thing to keep in focus, is that the overwhelming factor conferring impunity is the social status of the victims. It's the social status of the victims. You create a cast of people who are presumptively not credible, then you give cruel, abusive individuals complete license to toy with other human beings. You know, we've seen a version of that with the Me Too movement, with asymmetries of power in terms of gender, but and I don't want to minimize that for a moment. And we've also seen in that space the kind of the cruelty, the pleasure in humiliation. I'm choosing my words carefully when I say toy with people. You know, some of the behavior we've documented over the years is criminal behavior. Where are the guns and where are the drugs? You know, the police just living off the land and sort of plundering these poor communities. But a lot of the most wretched behavior is a kind of casual cruelty. Why did they do it? They did it because they could. And systems of radical inequality create spaces where that happens. And we have to shut those spaces down, you know, and the only way to do that is to create conditions of greater equality. A final observation, just in terms of our practice over the years in the work at Stateway and elsewhere, and I think it's, you know, just listening to this conversation and the tone of this meeting, I think there's continuing power in this idea that my formulation for the work at Stateway over all those many years was actually inspired by sort of Central European human rights activists in Czechoslovakia and Poland, who under totalitarianism, under conditions where citizenship was completely degraded and laughable as a role, had this brilliant idea, which was, let's see what happens if we behave as if we were free citizens. The sort of as-if principle. And really, you can plot the success of those movements over years. And what that meant initially was doing things that we take completely for granted, like holding an open meeting or writing a letter to the newspaper. But then it evolved into monitoring trials of dissidents. You know, it kept sort of expanding what it was. And of course, there was considerable courage in the sort of people who were in the vanguard of a movement like that, but every act creates space for more such acts in civil society. And so, sort of inspired by that, I thought of our work, and I offer it as a way of thinking about a lot of the work that various of us are engaged in, as my thought was, what would happen is if we behaved as if we were neighbors under conditions of urban apartheid? We all know how to be neighbors, right? Can I borrow a tool? You know, do you have a cup of sugar? Can you help me move this down tree out of my backyard? You know, we have a language of neighborliness. We know how to do this. You know, this is something we're good at, but we define who is within our neighborhood pretty rigidly, as Maya was describing with the Jefferson Park and other things. The whole conversation about hyper-segregation. I would offer, just as an rhetorical tool and an organizing tool, that the idea of a kind of militant radical neighborliness has power. It has real power. And I think it also relates to some possibilities that, our work back in the day at Stateway and work we do in other settings now relates to, is reinventing what public safety means. And I appreciate deeply the challenge that Black Lives Matter activists have presented to all of us with a stance with respect to abolition of the police. I don't regard it as a viable policy stance in terms of immediate questions. I think it's an invitation to our imaginations. And I think what
I would argue we can move into that space and think about is what public safety really means. And I think for me, the idea of safety has to do with being at home. It's a matter of people being at home in their skin, at home in their homes and with their families, at home on the streets of their community, at home in their cities. So the nexus between public safety and place, public safety and housing, couldn't be clearer. And again, these are big, broad ways of thinking and talking about these issues, but I think they lead to some concrete organizing strategies.
Thank you, Jamie. Daniel? And as we're winding down on time, so we could keep our comments a little bit brief.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, because I think Jamie and Eve kind of touched on what I wanted to say, which is, there's a lot of CTBA where I work does a lot of really deep in the weeds. We print long reports in size 10 font. One of the things, especially on housing, is it is hard for us often to get people, other than lovely people like you in this room, it's hard for us often to get people to be interested. It's hard for us to get members of the media to be interested. And I think part of that has to do with a sense of people's sense of what other people deserve and what people in public housing deserve, right? And there's a sort of bedrock sense that people don't deserve subsidized housing, affordable housing. There was this example of this when, and I don't mean to pick on the Sun-Times because it is certainly not only on the Sun-Times, but the Sun-Times did a whole series of articles about the CHA, many of which were very informative and I enjoyed, but they chose to begin the series by focusing on what they called super vouchers, which was essentially, the voucher program says that you get a certain amount of money pegged to what the average rent is, what HUD decides the average rent is in your metropolitan area. But as everybody in Chicago knows, if you choose, the average rent in your metropolitan area averages the Gold Coast with Chatham, with Austin, with Waukegan, with Oak Park, and so on, right? And so it does not provide enough money to move to some of the more accessible, more amenity-rich neighborhoods in the city. And so the CHA, not unique among other public housing authorities around the country, had this sort of experimental program where they were giving some people extra money through their voucher. The voucher was worth more so that they could move to neighborhoods where the rent was more. And the Sun-Times wrote this whole feature, 2,500 words or whatever, about this very small group of people, right? A couple dozen households, I believe, out of, again, 50,000, who were getting particularly large amounts to live in, relatively new buildings in the South Loop. And, the undertone of the whole thing was, look at these people who are getting what they don't deserve. And that was meant to, regardless of that particular policy, and I think you could very easily defend it, many of those people were living in elevator buildings because they were handicap accessible, right? And many older walk-up buildings are not. But it was meant to sort of represent the sort of broader population that gets this money. And what I would just say is I think part of the work in making this case is saying, hey, people do deserve housing, no matter what. People do deserve a roof over their head. And also to force, many of those middle class or upper middle class people to recognize that, in fact, many of them live in subsidized housing. We subsidize middle class housing in this country. And in fact, if you live in a $500,000 home in Oak Park, you probably get way more money through the mortgage interest tax deduction than somebody who gets a Section 8 voucher who lives in Greater Grand Crossing or South Shore. And in fact, nationally, we spend much more on people making well over $100,000 a year than we do on all low-income programs put together. And so, if you deserve that tax break on your $500,000 house in Oak Park, certainly someone else deserves a voucher or a hard unit to be able to have a roof over their head.
Thank you.
Back to politics. You're not going to get anywhere unless we get to politics and government, because the government's got the keys that you need, and we got to get a hold of them. So it's very simple. Now, a number of you belong to 501c3 organizations, not-for-profit, take foundation grants or whatever, and so they say they can't do politics. It's those very organizations that elected Harold Washington mayor, the only progressive mayor we've had in your generation. We did it once. We can do that again. Needs to happen not just with the mayor, but the city council. So the plan is really very simple. You need to get before the city council critical votes and make the alderman and the mayor vote on them. Maybe they vote them down. Then you can run against them saying, look, they voted against these people on housing. They let these crooks stay in the police department. They didn't take care of transportation. All that stuff is on the record. On the other hand, you may win some. They may have to give up some power and do the right thing to stay in office, and that's not a bad thing. So I'm not going to go into what you should do in 2018. I'm jumping a little ahead, but as a plan between now and 2019, you've got to get an agenda, a plan, and you've got to break it into pieces that come to actual votes and put people on the record and let them know they're going to be accountable for how they vote. And then that gives a platform for anyone who wants to run for alderman or run for mayor that'll actually do something of which we've already talked about what kinds of things could be done. So 2019 is the year. The day to start is now. And you need to have concrete proposals going to the vote in the city council and having the mayor take a stand on them, or we're not going to move anywhere at all. Yeah.
Make it a few sentences. I'm so sorry, Maya.
Well, it's actually works out great for me because I'm a journalist, and I got to be careful about the kind of solutions I'm proposing here because unlike Jamie, I don't have my own production company, so I have to stay employed. I think there are two things that I would advocate for in this context. One is to pay attention to the way that people, city officials, people in power, shape narratives around events that happen in the city, whether it's a school closing or a police shooting. They have a game plan when something bad happens, and they have a strategy for how to shape a narrative. And you have to pay attention to that. Like every news article that comes out in a major news daily, whether it's on TV or in a news publication, it doesn't exist unless there's some sort of official narrative. And as we saw with the Laquan McDonald situation, the official narrative of what happened bamboozled everybody. Mm-hmm. It was lies, and it was all, but nobody would have noticed if somebody didn't decide to start digging and start sending FOIA requests. And unfortunately, we in the media, especially those of us who work in a more daily kind of faster paced environment, there's this overwhelming like top-down pressure to think about what we're putting out there as what people want. Like people want that daily news story about the crazy thing that happened today, and they want to, they need a quote from the police department, and they need a quote from a witness on the scene, and none of it actually explains anything about what happened. But like the people in the newsrooms who are driving this narrative, who are the mouthpieces of official narratives, they have a concept of like, well, this is what people want because people click on this, because people subscribe to the newspapers. There's a lot of assumptions about you guys in like the work environment that I am in every day. So I think that as empowered consumers of the news media, you have to be vocal when you feel like something is off about the narratives that you're reading, when something doesn't seem to be right. And I mean, I'm not gonna encourage anybody to like not subscribe to the Sun-Times or not pick up the Reader or not tweet about news stories, because like I need a job and we do need the news media. But I would just encourage everybody to be an empowered consumer and to talk about what you are consuming in terms of news media, and that is the only way I think that your media, because it does belong to you. Journalism belongs to you, and it's only by being engaged and not just seeming like, oh, like you're clicking on this, like you're watching this news broadcast, you're fine with everything. It's only by giving some voice to questions you might have or criticisms or whatever that these dynamics in the media can change, I think, in order to give us more honest, historically driven, systemically oriented reporting. So.
Thank you. That was amazing. I want to thank all of our panelists for taking the time to help us and to speak to us and collaborate. Thank you so much, everyone.